The river was supposed to be their shield, a dark ribbon of moving cover that would hide them long enough for extraction, but it had turned into a trap. Thick brown water pressed against the collapsed embankment where the seals were pinned, the current tugging at their boots and the wreckage of their inflatable boats. The air smelled of wet earth, burned powder, and fear that no training could fully erase. Gunfire snapped from the jungle line with cruel discipline, rounds slicing leaves and bark so close that splinters peppered exposed skin. Every burst felt measured, patient, as if the forest itself had learned how to aim. One by one, the men checked their magazines again, hoping for a miracle that never came. The metallic click of empty chambers sounded louder than the enemy's guns. Blood ran from a torn shoulder, from a calf shredded by shrapnel, mixing with river water until it turned a slow, dark red that drifted downstream. The team leader pressed his back against the mud wall and tried to steady his breathing. His radio crackled with broken words, half-heard promises from command that meant nothing now. Air support was delayed, extraction was impossible. He looked at his men, at faces smeared with mud and sweat, eyes still sharp but dulled by the math they were all doing in their heads. This was how it ended. He swallowed, feeling the weight of history on his tongue, then raised the radio and spoke the words that would echo in him for the rest of his life. They were done. Around him, hands lifted slowly, fingers spread wide, weapons lowered and released. Rifles sank into the river with dull splashes, bubbles rising like small, accusing ghosts. The jungle fell quiet, not peaceful but expectant, the kind of silence that feels like a knife held just above skin. Upstream, hidden where reeds grew thick and the river bent sharply, a teenage boy lay flat against the damp earth. He had come before dawn with a line and hook, planning to fish before the heat grew unbearable. Instead, he had heard the first shots and crawled into cover, heart pounding, eyes wide. From this bend, sound played tricks, bouncing off water and stone, making distances lie. He knew this place better than anyone alive. His grandfather had taught him where the current slowed, where the reeds whispered loud enough to mask footsteps, where echoes could turn one sound into many. Through the narrow scope of an old rifle wrapped in cloth, he watched the strange soldiers by the riverbank. He did not know their language, but he knew surrender when he saw it. He also knew the men hidden in the trees behind them, knew their cruelty, knew what happened to those who raised empty hands. His fingers trembled, not from fear alone but from anger that burned hot and sudden in his chest. These soldiers were strangers, yet the enemy waiting to step out of the jungle were not. He had seen them pass through his village, had heard the screams that followed. The rifle had been his father's, hidden after a war no one officially remembered. He had fired it only a handful of times, always at tin cans or drifting wood, never at a living person. He rested it now on a piece of driftwood worn smooth by years of flood and sun, aligning the sights with a tree line that seemed too far, too impossible. The river murmured, steady and indifferent, and he matched his breathing to its rhythm the way his grandfather once taught him: slow inhale, slower exhale, letting the world narrow to a single point. Down by the embankment, boots crunched on leaves as the enemy began to move, confident now, careless. A voice barked an order. The boy's finger tightened. The first shot cracked like dry wood snapping, sharp and final. One of the figures at the jungle's edge collapsed without a sound, disappearing into the green. For a heartbeat, no one understood what had happened. Then shouting erupted, wild and confused, muzzle flashes flaring as bullets tore into empty reeds and water. The boy did not stay still. He slid sideways through the mud, firing again, then again, each shot timed with the slap of current against rock so it sounded like nothing more than the river answering itself. From the embankment, the seals froze in disbelief, hands still raised, then instinct slammed back into place. They dove, rolled, dragged rifles from the water, and the fight roared back to life. The sudden return of gunfire snapped the seals out of the numb stillness that surrender had brought. Hands that moments ago had been raised now moved with muscle memory honed by years of training. Rifles were ripped from the river, water streaming from barrels and optics as men slammed fresh magazines home with desperate force. The team leader shouted short, sharp commands, his voice cutting through the chaos, and the embankment erupted with disciplined return fire. What had felt like an ending only seconds earlier twisted into something else entirely. Confusion spread through the jungle as bullets no longer came from just one direction. The enemy had expected broken men. Instead, they faced fighters who had nothing left to lose. From his hidden bend upstream, the boy watched the reaction ripple across the riverbank. He could see the soldiers moving again, alive in a way they hadn't been before, and it filled him with a strange mix of fear and pride. He shifted position, crawling through wet reeds that clung to his clothes and skin, the mud sucking quietly at his elbows and knees. He knew he could not stay in one place for long. The men in the trees would search for him now, not knowing where he was but certain he existed. He moved the way he always had when avoiding patrols near his village, slow, deliberate, letting the river cover his sound. Each time he fired, he slid a few meters, becoming an idea instead of a target. Downstream, the fight turned sharp and violent. The jungle that had once felt like a solid wall now seemed to fracture as shouts overlapped, orders contradicted one another, and men broke cover too soon. A burst of fire from the embankment cut down a figure sprinting between trees. Another fell to a shot from upstream that came so unexpectedly it felt like the forest itself had turned traitor. The seals began to realize that someone unseen was shaping the battle, striking from angles that made no sense. They did not know who he was, only that his shots were deliberate, calm, and devastatingly precise. The team leader caught glimpses of the chaos through smoke and leaves and felt something close to awe push back the dread in his chest. The boy's world had narrowed to breath, movement, and the recoil of the rifle against his shoulder. Each shot sent a jolt through his body, a reminder that he was crossing a line he could never step back from. He aimed not wildly but carefully, choosing those who barked orders, those who exposed themselves in anger or panic. He waited through long seconds that felt like minutes, letting the enemy believe the threat had moved or vanished, then fired again from a new place. The river became his ally, its constant noise swallowing the sharp report of the rifle, its reflections confusing eyes already strained by fear. Sweat stung his eyes, and his arms began to ache, but he did not stop. At the embankment, a wounded seal cried out as a round tore into the dirt beside him, spraying mud across his face. Another dragged him back, applying pressure with hands that shook but did not fail. Amid the chaos, the team leader keyed his radio again, voice urgent now, alive with possibility. He called for extraction, for air support, for anything that could turn this sudden chance into survival. Above the trees, the distant thump of rotors answered faintly, so faint it might have been imagined, but it was enough. The men heard it and fought harder, louder, pushing forward meter by hard-earned meter. The enemy began to break. Fear replaced confidence as they realized they were being hit from the side and from the river, from places they could not see or predict. Some fired wildly, others fell back, dragging wounded, leaving weapons behind. Orders dissolved into shouted curses and desperate calls for retreat. The jungle swallowed them unevenly, one by one, until the gunfire thinned and then stopped in patches, leaving only the crackle of small fires and the constant rush of water. Upstream, the boy lowered the rifle slightly, chest heaving, listening. He knew better than to believe silence meant safety. He stayed low, watching for movement, finger still tense on the trigger. In the distance, the sound of helicopters grew louder, more certain, chopping through the humid air. He felt a sudden weight settle in his stomach. If the enemy found him now, there would be no escape. He wiped mud from his face with the back of his hand and crawled again, deeper into the reeds, becoming part of the riverbank itself. He did not look toward the soldiers anymore. He had done what he could. Now, he needed to disappear. The helicopters arrived like a storm tearing open the sky, rotors hammering the air so violently that the river flattened beneath the downdraft and spray exploded upward in white sheets. The sound drowned everything else, even thought, and for the seals on the embankment it felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare into chaos that somehow meant rescue. Smoke from burning foliage twisted into the rotor wash, stinging eyes already raw from sweat and dirt. The team leader waved a signal panel high above his head, arms screaming in protest as he marked their position. Ropes dropped, swaying wildly, and men moved with the last of their strength, hauling the wounded first, covering each other in practiced bursts. Every second felt stolen. They expected the jungle to erupt again at any moment, a final desperate counterattack, but it never came. As the last of the team clipped in and rose from the riverbank, boots leaving the mud that had nearly become their grave, the leader scanned the shoreline one final time. He searched the reeds, the bends of the river, the shadows where a miracle had taken shape. He wanted to see the one who had changed everything, to offer a nod, a word, anything that could acknowledge a debt too large to ever repay. There was nothing. Just water sliding past broken branches, carrying away shell casings, blood, and the echo of fear. The helicopter banked hard, lifting them above the canopy, and the river vanished beneath green. Far below and far away, the boy lay pressed against the cool earth, the rifle wrapped again in its cloth and hidden beneath a tangle of roots where his father had once shown him how to bury a secret. The roar of the helicopters faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of insects and water. His heart still raced, thudding so loudly he feared it might betray him. Only when the last echo disappeared did he allow himself to breathe deeply. His hands shook now, not with anger or purpose, but with the delayed weight of what he had done. He had watched men fall. He had chosen who would not stand again. The river did not judge him, but he judged himself in the quiet that followed. He waded downstream slowly, careful to erase signs of his passage, stepping where the current would blur footprints, pushing reeds back into place. The sun had climbed higher, turning the mist into heat that pressed against his skin. Somewhere, birds began to call again, tentative at first, then louder, as if testing whether it was safe to return to normal. By the time he reached the narrow path that led home, he looked like nothing more than a boy who had failed at fishing, empty-handed and tired. The rifle remained hidden behind him, a chapter of his life closed and buried in mud and memory. In the air, the seals sat in stunned silence broken only by the whine of engines and the labored breathing of the wounded. Medics worked quickly, efficiently, hands slick with blood but steady. The team leader finally lowered himself onto the metal floor, exhaustion crashing over him now that survival was no longer a question. He replayed the moment of surrender again and again, the shame he had tasted, the certainty that it was over, and then the impossible reversal. Somewhere out there, a single shooter had seen them not as invaders or strangers, but as men about to be erased. That knowledge settled heavily in his chest. When they reached base, the story would be told and retold, analyzed frame by frame. Reports would mention unexpected fire from an unknown position, a disruption that turned defeat into extraction. There would be theories, satellite images, arguments over what had really happened. But no report would capture the truth of it, the way hope had returned with the crack of a single rifle shot, or how close trained soldiers had come to disappearing into an unmarked stretch of riverbank. Back in his village, the boy washed the mud from his arms and face, watching brown water spiral down the drain. His mother asked if the fishing had been bad that morning. He nodded and said nothing more. That night, as he lay on his mat, sleep came in fragments. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the river, the raised hands, the sudden fall of a man at the tree line. He did not feel like a hero. He felt older, heavier, as if the river had taken something from him in exchange for the lives it had spared. Years later, the team leader would stand by another river in another country and feel a chill he could never fully explain. He would think of a place with no name on his maps, of a day when surrender had seemed inevitable, and of a presence he had never seen but would never forget. And the river, flowing on as it always had, kept the secret of the boy who rewrote a battle and asked for nothing in return.